Stephen Lawrence was just a teenager when he was murdered in a racist attack purely based on his skin colour. This was one of the most high-profile cases in UK criminal justice history. Stephen was violently attacked at a bus stop by a gang of 5 men on Wellhall Road in South East London in 1993 whilst waiting for a bus with his friend Dwayne Brooks. This was an obvious racist attack from the language that was used by the attackers, and they kicked, punched and stabbed Stephen twice, which was fatal. He was pronounced dead by the time he'd got to the hospital. This crime brought great shame on the biggest UK police force and highlights racial injustice in society and law enforcement. 4 years after the murder, there was an inquiry that determined that there was unjustified racism and professional incompetence when it came to solving this case. In 2006, a new team was brought together to try and solve the case of Stephen's murder, and the first port of call was for them to return to the crime scene. The problem with the original investigation in the 90s was that there was no effective scientific evidence, and Stephen's parents, now Baroness Doreen Lawrence and Dr. Neville Lawrence, were sceptical of the police response. Arrests had been made 2 weeks after the murder, but they had been released, and the CPS didn't progress any further with the prosecution. So Stephen's parents attempted to start a private prosecution in order to bring the killers to justice. They had all the evidence re-examined, and there was no more additional evidence found. Dwayne's evidence was also inadmissible, so the 2 suspects were acquitted, and this meant that they could never be tried for the case again under the law of double jeopardy. One of the senior investigating officers who originally worked on Stephen's murder believed he had fresh evidence that he could bring to the case. The original investigation determined that because the attack was so frenzied, it would have only lasted a few seconds. However, he believed that it could have taken anywhere between 15 and 23 seconds. This gives an opportunity for transference of fibres to occur between Stephen and his attackers, and because the attack was a lot longer than originally thought, this opened a larger window of opportunity for contact to occur between Stephen and his attacker, and a longer time frame for fibres to transfer between the two's clothing. Fibres and textiles can be so small that we can't see them with the naked eye, and we don't know what has transferred on our clothing day to day. Fortunately for the investigative team, Stephen's clothing was seized immediately. However, the suspect's clothing was only taken into evidence 2 weeks later, but there was still potential for lots of textile evidence on the attacker's clothing. On Stephen's clothes, there was a range of blood and red fibres, red cottons and red synthetics. Stephen was wearing a red polo shirt at the time that was shedding thousands of fibres, so the team thought it was worthwhile looking for these red fibres on the attacker's clothing. Stephen was also wearing a lot of layers that night, and the red shirt was the 3rd layer down, and it was still transferring fibres onto his outer jacket, giving the investigative team reasons to look at the assailant's clothing for these red fibres. When they analysed the suspect's clothes thread by thread, they used tapings and low-level microscopy to mark fibres of interest and isolate them for further analysis. The suspects at the time were Gary Dobson, who was already acquitted during the private prosecution. 11 fibres were found on his jacket, and they were sent for analysis and matched to the red fibres of Stephen's polo shirt. There was also another suspect whose clothes were seized during the investigation. His name was David Norris, and they managed to find 1 fibre on his jacket which also matched to the polo shirt Stephen was wearing. There were also a number of green fibres on David Norris's jacket, which matched to the corduroy trousers Stephen was wearing the night he was attacked. Textile evidence on his own is not enough for murder, so the team decided to see if there was anything in the original packaging that could help solidify the evidence. Amazingly, they managed to find a flake of dried blood in the original packaging that had blue fibres attached. This came from the evidence bag that contained Dobson's clothing. When the fibres were analysed, they matched to the cardigan Stephen was wearing that night. Whilst the blood flake was sent for DNA, the team looked to find where the blood had come from on the jacket seized as evidence. They looked through the jacket thread by thread and eventually found a small blood stain on the back of the collar of Dobson's jacket. During a knife attack, it's common for blood to fall down the back of someone's collar, as when they have a bloody knife and they're raising it behind their head, there's opportunity for the blood to flick off and fall down the back of someone's neck. As well as blood and fibre evidence, there were also 600 hairs that were taken from Stephen's clothing. They were analysed by a hair expert, and they identified that the hair came from either Asian or black origin, The issue they had with the hairs was that they appeared to have been freshly cut, so there was no root available for any further analysis. However, some of these hairs were found on Dobson and Norris's clothing, 2 of which were only 2mm and 1mm in length. The 1mm hair appeared to have blood, but it was too small for analysis, so they focused on the 2mm hair and sent it to a specialised lab in the United States for testing called mitochondrial sequencing. Mitochondrial DNA tests look at the matrilineal or mother-line ancestry through the mitochondria in the cells, which is only passed from mothers to their children. In the meantime, whilst waiting for the analysis to come back from the US, the results had come back from the blood flake found in the original packaging that housed the jacket from one of the attackers, and it was a match to Stephen. When the senior investigating officer received the phone call, he was attending a memorial service for Stephen, marking the 15th anniversary of his death. When the results came back from the mitochondrial testing, the team now had enough solid evidence to prove that Dobson and Norris were responsible for Stephen's murder, but the issue still remained that Dobson had already been acquitted during the private prosecution. Double jeopardy is a centuries-old law, which means that a person cannot be tried for the same case twice. However, the inquiry run in 1999 by Judge McPherson, who looked into the original investigation of Stephen's murder, determined that the investigation had been marred by a combination of professional incompetence, institutional racism, and a failure of leadership, and looked at recommendations to changing the law of double jeopardy. A person can now be tried for the same case if there is new and compelling evidence that is strong enough to determine that a person can go to trial. Stephen's case and the forensic evidence was taken to a court of appeal where the acquittal was overturned, as they determined there was enough evidence for the suspects to be tried again. The investigative and forensics team needed to make sure they had everything they could in place in order to find the suspects guilty. As this was such a high-profile case, there was a lot of pressure on the forensics and investigative team to make sure they got it right, both for Stephen and his family. Throughout the second investigation, the forensics team collected over 500 tubes of DNA, 250 pots of debris from clothing, which equated to 700 tapings, and a total of 4,500 fibres. And in January 2012, after a 6-week trial, the jury found both Dobson and Norris guilty of Stephen Lawrence's murder, and they were both sentenced to life. Without the work of the forensics team, there would have been no conviction for Stephen's murder to this day, and it has finally given the family of Stephen the answers and the justice that they deserve. If you like this video, don't forget to like, share and subscribe to the channel for more interesting case files, and let me know in the comments if there's any interesting cases you'd like to see on the channel. Thanks for watching and stay safe.